All right. All right. So thanks for joining. This is our fifth installment of Transform Digest. So we're doing these roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, stemming from our annual event. And Stephanie, we have a veteran of Transform. She's been kind enough to lend her expertise for several of our Transform events, and with us is with her is Jim and Mike. Encourage everybody to pop questions in the Q&A or the chat as we go. And we'll try to answer them in line. We'll save some time at the end as well for Q&A. But my first question is, I guess you guys didn't get the memo. Like, we're going to wear our rocker wigs for this, right? Like, so, you know.
UPS has failed to deliver mine.
Yeah, sorry, it's in the mail, but yeah, we didn't. I didn't
I have my
Nice.
R2D2 Mickey Mouse ears hat here somewhere.
Well, it's event. We were just talking as we were getting into this, like how physical events are starting again, and it's like with the virtual stuff, it's an event day when I like actually comb my hair. But for a second, I thought, maybe wear this from our promo video. But let's dive into intro. So Stephanie, maybe if you want to introduce yourself, and then Mike and Jim.
Sure. So my name's Stephane Atkinson. I've been leading Compass Intelligence for 16 plus years, and we are a market research and advisory firm focusing on IoT, mobile, and emerging technologies. I also recently founded a marketing agency, VMark, and I'm happy to be here.
Mike?
Yeah, do you want me to go next? Hi, I'm Michael Dolbec. It's great to be here. I'm with Momenta. We're a venture capital firm. We're the leading digital industry venture capital firm. So we're backing the next generation of digital and deep tech innovators, disruptors building the future of industry. We've been concentrating on the fields of AI and edge computing, where data meets outcomes, I suppose is the best way to summarize it.
Cool. And then Jim?
Hey folks, my name is Jim St. Ledger. I work for Intel based over in Phoenix, Arizona. Glad everybody could attend here today. My day job at Intel is focused on open source strategy and marketing. I spend my time in open source communities around networking, edge, and cloud native. And these days I cross paths with Jason and many others in an open source project called LF Edge, where Intel is pretty heavily involved in several of the projects in there for advancing security capabilities, connectedness of edge devices into analytics, AI, and the cloud. Great to meet everyone.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, thanks all for joining. Really appreciate it. Lee, if we can go to the next slide, we'll kind of just do a quick primer. I was joking before we're going to go through every stat from this survey line by line, very meticulously. But no, so we wanted to seed this discussion. This is all about kind of where are we at with edge computing. There's a lot of still a lot of confusion out there. Some folks are like, well, we've been doing edge computing forever, but we should kind of tease out some of the differences as the pendulum swings between centralized and decentralized. But what are some of the key challenges? What's motivating people? Who's doing what? These are the types of things that we'll want to talk about today. If you haven't seen it, and there should be a link also in the invite, but if you haven't seen it, we have a URL here for the survey that we did, and I know we'll talk about, Stephanie, the survey that you guys just put out, which is great. And but check it out. We did the sample size was fairly small, about 150 people. We got people from a lot of different pockets of industries, and then we also spent a good bit of time trying to disseminate between IT and OT, because when you look at edge, who does what, and perceptions of who does what are often quite varied. So we'll tease some of that as we go. It's good. Maybe we can just go to video now. And so cool. So one of the main things we saw, I mean, we see a lot of people coming, like kind of learning how to spell edge. It's a hot topic. I need to be doing edge computing. Why? I don't know. I think I need to be doing it, just like we saw with IoT and everything. But we did see, while a lot of the POCs, a lot of stuff is still in POC stage, investments, under 500,000 or whatever, a large number of people, about 3/4, saying that they're going to see up to 25% increase this year. So maybe Stephanie, I'll start with you. Kind of how does that jive with sort of the maturity levels that you're seeing out there with Edge?
Yeah, I mean, we saw some very similar, but we had a little bit more of a boost. We surveyed 5,000 plus business end users, but we also carved out a segment of that. About 2,700, a little bit more than 2,700 were buyers of Edge and IoT. And so we had around 40% say that they were expecting to see an increase in edge computing spend. So I think there's a lot of excitement around that. And we also, we also saw some results that were interesting, where 2 and 5 expected to see the increase, of course, but we generally talk about who's buying, right? The C-level executives and IT leaders are generally, they were kind of the leading buyers of those buyer groups, but we are seeing an increase in terms of line of business and operational managers. You mentioned IT versus OT, and about 28% of those.
Uh-oh.
It sounds like it's Stephanie.
I thought it was me for a second.
Yeah, exactly right. It's always the way when somebody freezes. Is that me freezing? Stephanie back?
It's how cold is it in Texas right now?
It's not too bad, although we'd started getting some little bit of ice flurries and whatnot.
So it's not like the wind farm for us.
It's live TV. So,
Yeah.
so Stephanie, I think your connection is, as you work on your connection, maybe we'll move to Mike. If kind of having seen things progress through the IoT days, not that that's over by any means, but just how have you seen things transform and change over time, and where do you see things coming up? Hey, Stephanie, we'll come back to you after. It looks like
I don't even know where I left off, but I'll come back.
So is this the segue from we don't talk to customers as often as your survey has or Stephanie's. We try and understand what customers are thinking through the startups that we're considering investing and the ones that we have in our portfolio. So I guess there is an increase in momentum that startups are. At first, everybody went under their desk in the first quarter of 2020, and we kept trying to figure out: what kind of recovery are we in? Will it ever recover? Is it a V? Is it a K? Is it a U? We ran out of letters trying to figure out what the shape of the recovery might be. But things definitely came back in a couple of the different quarters in 21, and in terms of startups being able to engage with enterprises. They found in many cases that the executives that they were chasing were more available because it was easier to schedule a meeting. They weren't traveling. And I guess the other thing, the comment I would make, I think it's based on something that Stephanie was saying, is that based on the companies that we typically invest in, the decision makers had, for the most part, almost exclusively been OT organizations. And now there's this interesting IT, OT, who's got the ball, who gets to make the decision. It's not exclusively always OT. We've seen IT organizations come in with high-class, sophisticated points of view, like, okay, what's the total cost of ownership here? How are we going to manage all this stuff over time? Sort of a perspective that is not primary with OT people. So that's healthy. I don't say it's consistent. It sort of varies by sophistication of organization. But so the sales cycle for startups, I guess the bottom line is become a little bit more complicated because there's a broader group of people involved in the decision in the evaluation.
Yeah. I know early in the IoT days, the startups that did the best, the last thing we needed is another IoT platform, but the startups that did best were very, very focused on one vertical, one use case, and that resonated with sort of the line of business and OT side. But so getting back to you, Stephanie, now that your connection's back, and then we'll get to you, Jim. So yeah, you were saying, because it is like you were saying that you're seeing IT decision makers coming in more, and maybe if you can kind of elaborate on some of the findings there, and to some degree, it's sort of like people are coming at the edge from OT up or IT down and sort of meeting in the middle, and there is this big
Right.
who's owning it. Any other thoughts, Stephanie, on kind of that trajectory and what you guys found?
Yeah, I mean, typically when you think about cloud computing, that just always was just an IT, right? An IT or CIO or CTO, they were making those decisions. But now, I believe because a lot of the need for edge computing is kind of pulls in a lot of IoT so-called solutions, then that's the big driver. We're seeing because IoT solutions really, the stakeholders are on the operational side. The influence is growing. So while traditionally, cloud edge, from a networking perspective, you would say, okay, those are IT leaders that are driving those and making those decisions. The stakeholders are changing. So I think that over time, we're going to see more and more buyers directly from the OT side. But as of now, in the early term, it does look like it's starting, that conversation is starting in IT.
So Jim, what are you've obviously, well, you see broader stuff at Intel, but then there's also kind of this IoT sort of coming up versus IT principles and edge and telco coming down, within
Right.
the work we're doing in LF Do you have some thoughts kind of on the two trajectories and how they're starting to kind of?
Yeah, I think, and there were some comments from Mike and Stephanie both that sort of fit into a sphere here that I'll talk about for a minute, right? The one is, you said earlier how some of the most successful IoT platforms are really focused on a specific market, specific end user. And for me, this is driven, I think, by the OT folks who know what they need, they know what their problems are, and if someone's going to bring them some kind of solution, they're going to look for what can this do for me, and then maybe they need some help from their IT folks to go and implement that. So I think that end user focus is good. Then the question is from the industry side of things, and whether that's open source or commercial, how many different solutions do you have out there, and is it best to have an individual solution that's uniquely tailored for a particular OT marketplace and workload and application, or is it better to have a more capable, flexible solution that might be able to drive some costs down due to economies of scale because it has applicability across a broader platform? I think those discussions and battles are happening today and will continue to happen. And what the answer is at the end of the day, we'll see. The one interesting thing, when I flipped through the data, there was one thing that really jumped out at me, and that was security. And folks who remember I think it was mid-December or so, the Log4j logging software Java platform, it's an open source platform that gets used all over the place, right? When Log4j shell came out as a remote executable exploit, the world went on fire to figure out, okay, where is this used? And the answer was it's used absolutely everywhere. It's used as an open source element into commercial code. It's used in folks that are using open source code across the board. And it's used in places people didn't even think about it being used. Some of the projects that were involved in an LF Edge, when I asked folks, hey, go off and check and see if it's being used. Some of them, I got a first answer back that said, no, we don't use that at all. And then they said, well, hold on. As we work through how our project gets deployed and works with other elements to create the solution, it gets used in there. So we do have 2 to 3 exposures of vulnerabilities we have to go and fix. And the security element, right? It's in the news almost every day when COVID and other geopolitical things aren't in the news as, another malware, another zero-day exploit. There's been a ration of those from Chrome and, iOS and a bunch of other ones of late. And those aren't going away. Those are going to continue to be there. So then the question is, how is best to drive awareness across these things? And this is where, when I looked at the data, IT seemed to have more awareness than OT. And I think there needs to be a mutual awareness brought up there on the security side. And then a discussion around how do we go mitigate software supply chains, software bill of materials, and harden that up as best as we can. So.
Yeah, it's funny. So one of the findings was, security was one of the top challenges or concerns that we had found. And IT folks were more concerned about it noticeably than OT. Now, historically, we're thinking historically,
Right.
Part of the way you do security in the industrial world is security by obscurity. You don't connect up to the cloud or broader network, but to drive insights, edge computing, IoT, et cetera, that's the catch-22 is you're connecting up to these different systems.
That's exactly right.
Maybe you don't know all the challenges yet. Usually a security conversation is, tell me it's going to be okay. Um, you know, so
Yeah,
it's
that
definitely,
doesn't instill a comfort level in your chief security officer at all, right? But to your point on connectivity, right? This is one of the things that's driven the whole change in the IoT market. Is this, we've talked about pervasive connectivity for years, and you could argue, well, you could have wired up an entire factory, and you could go into an old factory that's been around for decades and wire it up. It's just insanely expensive. Now all of a sudden, when you get to these wireless models, including things like private 5G networks and such, the wiring up through wireless technologies becomes really easy. Then you get into things like 5G and its capability to add all these supported devices because of its ability to handle more devices across the network. But then you get into transiting all that data, which drives analytics at the edge and edge computing and utilizing the cloud where appropriate. And all of a sudden you're into this model to where, yeah, I'm going to get these benefits by connectivity, cloud, local edge computing processing, but I'm going to have these additional risks of things like the exact same thing, connectivity and potential exposure, if I don't understand my secure aspects of things and hardening things where appropriate, including data provenance, for example.
I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying about security. I think it's also much more complex, and the organizations that are being asked to address it have either no experience or a lot less experience or not relevant experience securing the manifold new use cases that exist. What is it we're trying to secure? And because it's not one or two generic kinds of pervasive computing platforms endpoints, it's a lot of different stuff that is heterogeneous most of the time. So even the teams of people or CISOs that are asked to think about security in this new realm, I don't think the old playbook applies, strictly speaking. I mean, in general, you ought to be more secure, and you ought to notice when intrusions happen and figure out how to respond. But that's about where the similarity ends. So there's a lot of there. It reminds me of a quote. As an investor, all those problems turn into opportunities for us. But this old quote from John Gardner, who's a contributor to Scientific American. What we have before us are some breathtaking opportunities disguised as insoluble problems or really complex problems. But I wouldn't, securing whatever edge computing is not as straightforward as securing whatever enterprise computing is. It's even more complex. And so it's going to be a challenge. It represents lots of opportunity for companies that we've either invested in or will invest in. There's an explosion
points, Mike.
I was gonna
innovation there.
I would add too is we asked the IT buyers. We said, well, what are some of the most critical factors that are important to you before you make a buying decision around edge computing and security? It just stuck out like a sore thumb. And so same thing that you guys are seeing, a lot of the other elements, but when you think about edge computing, of course, you think it's real-time intelligence, it's critical communications, it's things that are very important to an industrial piece of equipment or a factory floor or whatever. So it just makes sense. We go from centralized to decentralized. They want to know what are the risks involved if this edge node is compromised. Maybe it's not taking down all the other edge nodes because it is decentralized, but we still have all these varying security questions. And I think that right now the industry really needs to flesh that out, because I don't think that there are a lot of answers that are communicated effectively to the enterprise or a government customer that says, yes, I feel like if I invest in this and I start to scale this across whatever solution I'm implementing, that I'm going to be going to have a level of security that I'm going to be comfortable with. So I think that we have a lot of education and a lot of figuring out what we're going to do in that particular space if we are going to see this take off.
Yeah, I've seen you having done IoT for a long time and then edge, a lot of shadow IT early on. Basically bypass IT. One of the results in the survey we saw is we asked, between different groups, how much are you from the clouds? How much are you using PaaS, like Azure IoT versus infrastructure, just Azure, AWS IoT versus AWS OT. was noticeably more using the platform's PaaS than IT, because I can just basically go consume it as a service and bypass IT in some cases.
Mhm.
But increasingly, we're finding a lot of folks that are coming to us. Ideally, I mean, we're seeing people more and more coming to us as both sides of the equation kind of coming together and whatnot, where they bring their respective strengths. So it's definitely been an interesting transition. Let me see. So there's a so. Oh yeah, one of the questions was what percent of the current IT buyers, edge customers, are connecting to the hyperscalers. So we see quite a bit, of that. Very broad adoption. We in the survey we saw, in manufacturing, Azure was a clear standout. And you just given the long history of Microsoft working in the manufacturing realm, but otherwise it was somewhat split. But yeah, definitely a lot of trajectory that way. Other thoughts on, when it gets into use cases a bit, like, Mike, in terms of sort of how you've seen, the investments that you guys have made as we've gone kind of from like, the thing is, like 5 years ago, it was like, buy my IoT platform. What am I supposed to do with it? I don't know. Just buy it and you'll figure it out. Like what are you seeing as where people are putting kind of value in terms of their businesses and where they're innovating these days?
I think that the low-hanging fruit is still the connected asset use case, which is somewhat less complex than what you do with all the. So where's my stuff and is it on and still working is kind of dashboard phase. There's a maturity curve that people are on, but there's so many people that haven't connected or wish they had a dashboard for their fleet of things. The remote monitoring of connected assets, I think, will continue to be a important use case, even though that's kind of at the lower end of the value chain. There are still, there are many people that have deployed, let's say, predictive analytics or predictive maintenance purposes, either for them, an OEM does it for their own equipment, or a company does it to manage their fleet of stuff so that operational failures don't happen and interrupt things. There is I'm happy to report that there is a rising instance of sort of service providers monitoring fleets of stuff, the way ADS monitors your home sometimes if you have an alarm system. There are a growing number of people who want to provide that service and monitor the stuff either in your home or in your factory or in some, I don't know, pharma production environment. And the, the, the pharma company itself doesn't want to build that capability, but they're more than happy to outsource it to someone else, sort of a network operations center. And vaguely similar to the way the security operations centers work. If you are an enterprise and you can outsource security monitoring if you don't want to build your own organization. So that's an interesting use case. That's I hire somebody else to monitor my stuff, but it means it has to be connected and so forth. And then the most interesting cases to us as investors recently, I think you mentioned there was a question about connecting to hyperscalers where it's sort of an edge to cloud use case. We're starting to see, and maybe it's been happening for a while, but it's only now coming into vision for me, situations where people have workloads that were initially developed for the cloud, a sort of central cloud computing, cloud first metaphor. They're starting to figure out how to either split those workloads and figure out which part of it can be moved to edge infrastructure, or in some cases wholesale, just put it at the edge and never talk to the cloud for the most part, or hardly ever talk to it. Recreate the cloud locally, not literally, but conceptually. And where the workload was developed with cloud resources in mind and without a huge amount of effort could be rehomed, if you will. That's a very interesting trend for me, because there's a whole lot of developers that know how to develop solutions in a cloud environment that's much more uniform somewhat than the many different the heterogeneity in the IoT world. So
one of the sayings we have at ZEDEDA is the edge is the last cloud to build. Take all of those principles that we've developed, in the cloud over the years and extend them back out into the field. And this whole notion of new delivery models and the easy button and all that.
there is the one last part is that, whatever you think the edge is, there's one farther out than you.
Yeah.
And so we have an investment in Edge Impulse, and they have a way of moving machine learning training and inference out to MCUs, out beyond traditional CPUs or even GPUs. And I don't know if it's real or not, but just before this webinar started, I got a business plan for tissue computing, which is, I think, has something to do with using real neurons to do something that neural nets might do. So that's an edge that's, really far
Cool.
out.
Well, octopuses have a brain in every arm, so they do edge compuing.
There you go.
So
In the,
everybody's
the
pursuing
real bio world.
distribute. How much can we distribute to some advantage? In my mind, edge computing is all about arbitraging. How much you spend to do something intelligent with data you found somewhere, and if you can do that in a distributed way, sometimes you can save a lot of money or react very quickly, and that can be valuable in some cases.
Stephanie, you were going to say something, but also I was, what Mike was saying around, the kind of new types of services and whatnot. I mean, I'm a firm believer in it's less about the widgets and more about how it's delivered going forward. And in your report, I noticed, you see SMB as a big underserved market, and to kind of expand on that and how the services, doing things as a service might help.
Yeah, so, and this is often the case that the mid-sized kind of business segment's underserved. I think a lot of big tech companies go after that enterprise customer. And so the sweet spot we found for edge computing are those companies with between 100 and 999 employees. The budgets, the investment, the planning, all of that, the mid-sized business segment was always higher on every response compared to the enterprise segment, which was very interesting, I thought, because it's often underserved and not targeted as much, right? As you start to move down market, some of those projects and those deals kind of fall off, or we don't go after them. But in terms of use cases, and really similar results across midsize and enterprise, asset tracking, like Mike said, that was like 1 in 3 of the IT buyers said that's the biggest use case. And then outside of that, it really came down to some of the typical things that we, I guess, as an industry, from an IoT perspective, have been looking at for quite some time. And it comes down to real-time manufacturing, alerting, notifications, just really pulling in just information that maybe an executive or a factory floor manager or someone that's managing something needs to be aware of. Again, I know you mentioned predictive maintenance that ranked very high in critical communications as well. But the interesting thing about asset monitoring is for those healthcare workers, that patient monitoring piece was just skyrocketed. So there are some pretty unique, I guess, use cases that I think will come out of this because we need real-time information monitoring and tracking. So for example, patient monitoring and tracking. With COVID and the pandemic, those at home and home healthcare is just, that's one of the biggest kind of growing opportunities for the health tech market. And so it's just a no-brainer that, hospitals, clinicians, they want to have the capability and the ability to track and monitor patients, not only their vitals or chronic diseases, but those that fall into different categories. So I think that piece was interesting. But for the mid-sized business segment, I think we as an industry really need to start to better understand that piece of the market, because there's just a growing number of them that they need education. They need to learn more about what it means to their industry. That was one of the other findings from this report, is that a lot of the general information that's out there is really just kind of real light. It's real superficial. So the more that we apply this to a particular industry and showcase how this changes, saves money, all the typical things, costs, then that's where we believe we're going to see more movement for edge computing. And of course, it's a lot of the I guess faster growing opportunities we see are kind of revolve around the sensor networks, Internet of Things solutions that are being applied to certain business operational. It's all, to me, it's from the operational side all the way to the customer experience. So where do we fit in between that edge computing is going to make an impact or make a difference?
Make a difference. Yeah, it's interesting, Mike and Stephanie, listen to both of you. When I think about a lot of my work, both in open source communities and at Intel, especially, Mobile World Congress is coming up. When we work to say, okay, hey, what can we demonstrate and show from a technology capability? We often look for the most complicated solutions out there, using a computer vision system with some analytical software like Intel OpenVINO, applied to a factory floor, connecting up a network of devices, sending some data to the cloud, et cetera. But what both of you reminded us of, which is just the basic things as simple as asset tracking can provide tremendous value. They aren't nearly as flashy, but there's something that establishes a very strong baseline need. And I do think there's probably a business strategy, to your point, Stephanie, especially for SMB, to say, go figure out what's the table stakes entry that could make a huge difference for them, and get in the door with a network that adds that. And then once you're in, you can then bring to them an a la carte menu of additional capabilities. Maybe it's analytics, maybe it's additional AI capabilities through the cloud or local infrastructure that then can take it to the next level. I do think you're right, though. The focus has to be on what problems can you solve for the OT folks? What value can you bring and make a difference out there in the industry?
And we didn't see this as much in the survey, but we're hearing the buzz out there in the industry from the tech vendors is the use case of autonomous vehicles and intelligent transportation, just because that's all about real-time intelligence, right? And communicating from the vehicle to the traffic management systems, back to the city, routing, all of that good stuff. So it's something that our survey didn't pull out as much, but that's kind of I think that's probably going to be something that we'll see down the road as well.
So we see there's several questions that are all interrelated. We're talking about use cases, and one of the key questions is, which use cases does Edge really help with versus which use cases could you just as well do in the cloud, and why? And obviously, the reasons for Edge is latency, bandwidth, security, privacy, autonomy, and whatnot. But it's always important to ask, what's the most efficient way of doing things? Is one of the questions is, clearly the cloud with infrastructure, platform as a service, easy button, pay as you go. It's handy. Yeah. But at the same time, you get to some of these needs where it's I can't afford downtime. It costs a lot of money to move data across networks. Things like that.
Costs even more sometimes to move it out of clouds. Right?
Yeah, the only I always say the people that computer vision, it's definitely a killer app for Edge, and the people that think it's a good idea to send network raw video over networks sell you network connectivity. It's a bad idea.
Meters running when your traffic's flowing, right? So
yeah, so it all kind of comes back to one of the questions here. Is Edge accelerating, cloud decelerating? Is it both? Is it neither? What do you see as the kind of relationship between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that from our survey, we show like this year, it's still cloud spend will still outpace Edge, but we expect that to shift. And I think that with the larger the enterprise in terms of number of locations and what industry that they're in, so we kind of like to map it out like an ecosystem. What are what's critical communications? What are critical data points that are needed? What are they doing operationally versus in front of the customer that data might be important? But all of those factors lead to, just the acceleration of edge computing and the need for edge computing. So the spend will shift, but we do believe that on the larger the business or the larger the enterprise, the more likely they're going to have a hybrid approach. They're going to need experts, vendors. They're going to need the entire community to help educate on applications are going to be most relevant, what's important to their business that they should move to the edge, they should move closer to the building or the equipment, or a piece, something that needs to be monitored. And that, I think there's a lot of elements that we will need to kind of check through and walk through with the customer to help them develop their cloud and edge strategy. But we will see just a hybrid of solutions that are out there. And, I think a lot of people talk about fog or somewhere in between, but we're going to see a mixed bag of what's needed. What are the core applications for edge versus what can remain in the cloud that we just will always use the cloud for. And again, I think you guys mentioned that the edge will also leverage the cloud. So we're going to have a mixed bag there.
Jason, I think for me, it's the proverbial answer of it depends, right? Which is so often the case. And it depends on what you're doing. Stephanie talked about autonomous vehicles, slash smart roads and smart cities, et cetera. And all those are going to depend on something that's so latency sensitive for safety and real world impact and results. That latency is going to rise to the top of your list. And those are the cases where certain amount of latency sensitive aspects, you're not sending this up to the cloud and back because that round trip time will make a difference. There'll be other scenarios. Go ahead.
I've heard a lot of people say you're going to drive your car through 5G, and I'm like, no. that's not going to happen. Coordinating with traffic and lights and all that kind of stuff for sure. But sorry,
No, you're exactly right. But the cloud is absolutely going to play a role, because even in those situations where I'll make up a scenario where maybe 80% of the data you're monitoring is so latency sensitive, you're going to need some edge processing analytics on that. But then there's going to be an element of, all right, what are the key summaries or conclusions or data points that I am going to send to the cloud that are less sensitive? So the cloud is going to play a role in it, I think, in almost all cases, in my view. Then the question is, what type of cloud model, right? There was a conversation earlier about infrastructure versus platforms as service. There's the blend of what do you want to do in a cloud versus on-prem, and some of the cloud providers that have their own IoT solutions, of course, will go ship you an edge box as well to sort of bolt right into a turnkey system. And I don't know, Stephanie, have you seen any data for SMB folks as to, are they looking for a turnkey cloud provider IoT solution, or is that still kind of a mixed market?
Yeah, of course. The smaller the entity, the more likely they want the out of the box or as a service type, business model. But we also found, and this was across the board, that one of the reasons why they're not implementing edge computing or haven't yet is because they believe it to be too complex. So the smaller the business, they need simplification. I think some enterprise users, they have more of an IT team, right? They can start to figure out the complexities from a network or installation or scale perspective and how they're going to structure their strategy. But the smaller or the mid-sized businesses, they may or may not have that expertise. So they're really looking into the vendor community to help them figure out where they go with cloud, where they go with edge, and what data is important. How often do I need access to data? What data needs to be secure? What data I don't really need to be secure? There's all these little questions that kind of will help, as you guide that enterprise customer or city or whatever, will help them better figure out what direction they need to go. But they need that more so. They need the vendor to community to really step up their game to really help them support those decisions.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts on kind of the either or both, neither?
There's no doubt. Edge computing is rapidly accelerating, partly because of momentum and partly because the definition of what it is and where you do it is also rapidly expanding. So in about 8 years, there will be several 100 billion machine learning capable MCUs in the world. They're shipping in the, I think, capability wise in the billions per year now. So, and there are use cases that we can't even imagine that will become very mundane. We'll just think it's, you remember the time when this thing used to be stupid and
how did we live without it,
in a brilliant way, or didn't ignore me when I thought it should ignore me, but pay attention when I think it should. It's about to become so pervasive that we're going to take it for granted. So there's no doubt that it's growing. The cloud is not slowing down either. I think people are just getting better at figuring out where to do computing and interesting computing tasks involving inference and maybe vision interpretation seem to be very, very high on the list of things to arbitrage and not do in the cloud that often.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think it's definitely not, there's a lot of clickbait around the cloud's going away and stuff like that. Edge will eat the cloud and whatnot.
It'd be like saying, do you think the market for sensing is shrinking?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think we're just going to get more creative about how smart we are after we sense something.
And new sensors, you can figure out any more of it, right?
Yeah, everything, it always sounds like a good idea too. I think this is part of the pendulum shifting, and I mean, nothing against cloud. Cloud is, there's incredible things, incredible benefits, but everything sounds good to do easy button and centralize until you get the bill. And when you start seeing a lot of data flowing and things like that, then and the egress charges and things like that, it starts to add up, and then you start thinking about where is the right place along the continuum.
In a odd way, the thing that's shrinking is the thinking that everything ought to be done in that, on somebody else's computer elsewhere called the cloud,
right,
which was kind of easy to default to because it had such a great momentum. I think now it's fair to say, well, not everything ought to be considered as a cloud first application. In some cases, maybe it's better not done there or exclusively there. And that's the big change. Not that one it's certainly not declining, it's got rapid growth, but it's the default thinking that you always should go there that has been a sea change.
Yeah, I think that's I liken it to, usually in new markets, easy button, curated, to some degree closed ecosystem wins first. And then people start realizing I need choice. I mean, you look at iOS, that curated ecosystem comes out, make it like super easy to adopt and whatnot. And then people, then Android, of course, Android's got like 80% of the market globally, and then it's just kind of a play off of this open versus closed, curated versus flexibility. And I think we're getting to that point where people want to see advanced class and have the flexibility and just kind of find where along that continuum it makes sense to do certain things.
And some of the rich use cases, somebody else brought up computer vision, and so I'll continue to go after that topic. That's a super broad use case, and there are different market segments that are some are very open to the easy button. Just don't make it too hard for me to deploy this because I have I'm not driving around in some random highway where anything can happen. I have a very controlled environment in a factory, and I make widgets. And I control the position and the lighting and everything else. So looking for a defect is not a hugely complex vision task. Mm-hmm. So the easy button approach, I think there's a ripe market for that. Other cases, unfortunately, you can't constrain the environment. Autonomy is maybe at the far end of that, and so there's room for lots of different solutions. We've learned you can't easy button autonomy. May never get to level 5, at least not quick. So, but there's quite a breadth of approaches, even within certain use cases. And different companies are learning how to mine. How do I go find efficiently the people that are ready for the easy button? How do I go find somebody with a complex vision task that is stuck because their productivity isn't as high as they'd like? There's different playbooks for different approaches.
Yeah, and I think Jim, get to you like on kind of the open source side. So one of the things we saw in our survey is multi-cloud strategy pops up and is important, and open source, increasing investment there. And this notion of how do I leverage a shared investment to be able to focus on stuff that really matters, and then also how do I leverage kind of open technologies to reduce dependence or hard coupling to things, because as you said, it depends what we're going to see long term, and so kind of preparing with the right architectures today. So kind of thoughts on that, and given.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things on that, right? So a lot of the folks, by the way, in the OT space, I think they and a lot of enterprise folks as well are very much used to paying for a commercial hardened solution that is just comes with tech support for it. Open source, years ago, there was I'll call it in the early open source days, 15, 20 plus years ago, there was this view, open source is free. And the answer is it's actually never free. It's a question of how you pay for it. Do you pay for it because you hire your own team of software engineers, developers, and experts, or do you buy that support service from a vendor? In the Linux model, you can roll your own Linux, you can go to Red Hat, Canonical, SUSE, et cetera, and buy a supported distribution. And I think the really large companies that have their teams and want to custom it, do it themselves, and the rest of the world goes and buys it because they don't view that as a differentiator. And I think what we're seeing now in edge computing is the same kind of thing. The single biggest, or one of the single biggest things that open source brings you is this sense of converge, share, innovation. The good news side of it is you get a lot of diverse views and opinions and creative minds coming together to go and build something. And usually that can happen much faster than you might be able to do internally because the resourcing of it is spread out such. The flip side of it from a competitive perspective, if you're trying to differentiate yourself, is the fact that it's open and typically pervasively licensed under an Apache 2 or BSD or other similar pervasive license means that anyone can take it and deploy it. Now, if you're an end user, having something that has a broader support network is a great thing for you because it typically leads to choice. And again, those choices can range from, hey, I'll support it myself. I'll put some engineers in the community. They'll understand it. They'll support it when I go deploy it. Or in a perfect world, you'll have an open source project that's doing what you want, and several vendors will go and take it and offer a commercial solution built around that. So right now, those kind of things I think are playing out around edge. There's a lot of, to Mike's point, there's a lot of startups happening in the edge. Often they're using what I'll call a hybrid model, which is they have an open source component, and then they have a unique differentiator that they have themselves. And that differentiator might send you down their path, or you might look at other vendors that provide a similar function on their own. In some cases, that differentiator may actually have an open model as well. And it's a question of who's got the one that meets your needs or is quote unquote the best. The best is always relative based on where you're sitting.
Are you, Jim, are you talking about they use open source software to achieve their goal, or they provide something they do as open source to their customers?
Well, so actually both. So I'll play this through, right? So if you're someone who's, a lot of times companies will build their model essentially around an open source project to where the core software itself is free, but having the service and support and technical readiness around it is your pay for value add. And that's everything from, hey, who's going to manage my patching and security updates, and when a CVE comes out, to upgrading to a next version as we go forward in time. So some companies, their whole model is built on the open source software itself and then providing this wrap of services. There's others that use the core software itself and then build around it and then go and ship and deploy a hardened commercial product that has open source at its core, but has their own proprietary additional features, capabilities built on top of it. So there's actually both models happening out there today.
Thank you. It was a Socratic question. Yes.
Yeah.
So there was another question around security, and I saw Stephanie, you dropped some stuff in there. And one last thing on the open source. So a lot of people think open source is less secure, and there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about it. Thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, this is so. I'll give you two answers, right? So the open source community, and I think a fair number of security researchers would agree with the fact that making all the code transparent inherently makes it more secure. And the reason behind that statement, they would say, is that there's more eyes on it, there's more eyeballs on it to go and look for issues and problems, to expose them and then go and fix them. I think that model is generally true, but the requirement to make it work is that you have enough eyeballs on it to look for those problems. And those are a few situations where, if you take a widely used legacy product or legacy project out there, where it may run into trouble is when so many people are using it and so few people are supporting it, the people aren't constantly looking at it and exploring it for potential exploits and problems. But the visibility and transparency of it does give the opportunity for making it much more secure. And I think generally speaking, that's proven to be the case. The privacy model of, proprietary closed, no source available code, the argument there, of course, and I think one of you mentioned it earlier, which is, hey, you can't see anything here, so therefore you can't find any problems. Well, if you're in the black hat hacker world, looking for an exploit to put to use for your own benefits, whether it's a ransomware opportunity or data theft or what have you, enough about how software works to understand how libraries are built to then start attacking the code and doing, malicious data inserts to see if you can cause a Stack Overflow or some other problem to then see if you can find a way in. And that's still possible with, code that doesn't have source shared. The problem is the people that are really good at it usually are on the bad side of the hacking community instead of the good side of it. So pros and cons from both. The best companies providing the software spend a very large chunk of their own time making sure their code is secure and doing their own hacking, whether it's internal hackathons or bug bounty fests or whatever. Open source communities put bug bounty programs in place and also do what they call bug smashing events, usually tied to a community event to go and hunt down problems like that. So a couple options, perspectives.
Cool. So I wanted to see, so in terms of some of the challenges, so security, obviously a hot topic. And I think security, usability, and Stephanie, you kind of hit on that in some of the chat things, is like packaging it up and making it easier to consume, not so hard, don't lock things down so much that no one wants to work with it, but also appropriately. So that's a challenge. The other things we saw pop up were device management, people, personnel, different skill sets, things like that. Just the cost of deployment, doing things in the physical world, is difficult compared to going to centralized locations. We actually see quite often folks are like, well, I don't care about security and device management. I care about my first app. I want to drive the outcome. But then once you get past first app, you're like, oh, yeah, that's really hard to do in the real world. Thoughts on those types of challenges, other challenges or thoughts on those, Stephanie, the security, device management, just the people part?
Yeah, I think, when any of these solutions that we're talking about, when we're applying this to a particular industry or use case, or we're trying to really show the value proposition of it, just as we've seen with IoT that we've been working on for years, is that this is not a generally a one vendor, one-stop shop. And so just as we've seen with the IoT community and ecosystem, a lot of you guys that are out there that are serving customers, you guys are building your partnerships, your alliances, and you're working together. You're working with these forums, or you're jointly developing maybe security solutions to really start to figure out how do we take the complexity out of this. And so same thing I think that we'll see with edge computing. We're going to see a lot of co-opetition, and we're going to see a lot of vendors that are going to build kind of their ecosystem and who they're working with, and they're going to have experts and specialists that know what to do when it comes to specific industries or specific use cases or specific security incidents, those kinds of things. And so I think that because we are in the earlier stages of this industry, we're not there yet. And I think that we're going to expect to see more of these alliances come together to really support in the advancement of edge computing. But I think that we're at the nascent stage right now. And so I do expect to see a lot of movement in that space over the next few years as, startups, new companies that have been in this industry, been serving tech companies forever, are going to look to some of these specialist companies to come in and help, figure that out. So I think a lot of the excitement is in the new companies, the startups, the fast growing companies that are starting from scratch, and they're just a lot more nimble, and they're starting to figure out a lot of the challenges that we're having as in an industry as a whole at a much faster pace than these large tech companies do.
Well, one of the things, if you look at like the industrial space and a lot of different markets, the name of the game for a long time was create a lock-in strategy. And there was a question about proprietary protocols in the industrial space. Create my own protocols, so then you're locked into my world.
Right.
And buy up any company that challenges me and kill it off. but with the maker movement, with startup, the pace of innovation now, there's so much stuff happening that I don't think there's enough money to buy everyone up and come. So you have to either change or you start to have some real challenges, and that's one of the big drivers, I think, of this. A lot of all the technology and adoption and confusion at the same time. We only have a couple minutes left, but Mike, kind of get your final thoughts, on that, or otherwise. Obviously, you're right in the middle of the whole startup investment world, but kind of where do you see things headed?
Okay, which question should I address? The lock-in question, or the
No,
sensitivity to vendor lock-in, or
yeah,
the
just like
what's happening in
the
security?
trend of the trend of startups, kind of changing the equation on how people do lock in or how people consider their ecosystem model. Kind of where do we see things headed, like longer term?
I okay. I'm sure a startup would love to be locked in. From a vendor
Sure.
perspective, a supplier, the less variation you have to worry about, the better. On the industrial side, frankly, unlike enterprise where the customers rose up and said, "We have seen this movie before. We don't want to be single sourced to anybody. We want competition. We want you guys. I don't want to be locked in." For reasons I don't fully understand, the industrial world has defaulted to something that's, oh, I guess my favorite two vendors are these guys, and I support their products, and now I can only buy from them. It's and they provided all the hand holding that's been necessary. Sorry, I guess I don't know if you can hear the printer going off, but
No.
it's just like I'm in the data center room of my house.
There you go.
The what Back way early in our conversation, we were talking about how IT decision makers have entered the OT and started to compete the OT decision process. One of the biggest influences I've been seeing is the IT guys going to the OT guys. Hey, lock in. Why are you guys so happy to just fall into the arms of one vendor? Let's have more. God forbid, don't buy the entire stack from one person, because that would be bad. Of course, the OT person says, "Oh my God, it might not work. I'd have to figure out how to make it work all the time and keep it supported." But I guess it's healthy. So I see it as the IT decision makers bringing wisdom from the enterprise sourcing and purchasing world, and trying to avoid too much vendor lock-in. Struggling with the OT people whose sole job is, look, I don't care about lock-in. I just have to not have this manufacturing facility stop, right? I can't afford failure. So whatever price I have to pay, as long as nobody gets hurt, that's a pretty reasonable price to pay.
Yeah.
So it's two
Yeah.
different worlds.
Yeah, security is a means to the real end in, as an example, in OT, which is uptime and safety. And
Well, I wasn't thinking about security lock-in, but
no, but I mean, just in terms of like where the concerns lie, it's like all the
right.
IT concerns
Okay.
around security and data
Yeah.
governance. Like, no, I care about it, but I really care about
Right.
uptime and safety. And
Another
Your
thing,
Pareto problems.
looking at it from the startup's point of view, they're always trying to efficiently acquire customers and not run out of cash before they can, make revenue. And one of the maturity steps that I like to see our companies get to is they either can sell direct, or more frequently they develop very profitable relationships with systems integrators who are designing a whole solution for a customer, and the startup becomes part of the standard recipe for it's the kosher salt that you always have to add to certain recipes because you need kosher salt. It tastes right and the other one isn't right. So we've got a security systems integrator that's built a standard playbook for stamping out security solutions for critical infrastructure, and they intend to use this approach of one of our startups to enable part of what they're trying to achieve security wise. It's good enough. It's probably the best one available now, but for them it's just reliable enough to keep deploying and stamping out. If a startup can get, that's not exactly lock in, but that's a buy-in to somebody else's standard solution that they're selling. Be part of another standard solution. That's huge for a startup's predictability of revenue.
Cool. So I know we're at time. Really appreciate it, guys, like for joining and lending your expertise. And I think at the kind of the net summary is, we're it's not like the cloud's going away, but like take the lessons that we've learned in the expansion of the cloud over the past number of years, platform independence, loosely coupled, all of the security things, to give us more flexibility in how we develop solutions more rapidly, decide what level of lock-in makes sense. But if you architect right today and think about these kind of decoupling points, it depends. Any permutation of edge to cloud over time will work, and you just can't. We're going to learn over time where things really lie, and where the meaningful use cases and all of that are. So, but yeah, so definitely feel free to carry on the conversation. After the fact, go check out Stephanie's report, the report that we had done, and feel free to ping any of you guys, the folks on LinkedIn, and again, really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time for another episode here soon.
Thank you
That's
for
good.
having us.
Thanks, guys.
Jason.
Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.